Well, we suspected that the virus was artificial and had been made through a standard method from 6 separate segments of DNA synthesized in a lab and then strung together into a complete virus. So that was a suggestion which had been made in 2022, but brushed aside by the scientists who have been advocating for a natural origin of the virus.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Context and consequence. Even more than partisanship, those two words explain the legacy corporate media's loss of market share, which is a manifestation of bygone trust. Instead of explaining events to drive understanding, these former gatekeepers shill for corporate and political interests. Failing to serve as a check on authority completes the abdication of their responsibilities. Nowhere was this more evident than during the COVID pandemic, and there was no example more illustrative of the COVIDian DC press corps' lack of intellectual curiosity than their treatment of the question of the virus's origin. But thanks to a cadre of dogged scientists and serious journalists, the truth is trickling out. One of the journalists advancing that cause is award-winning British author and journalist Nicholas Wade. Wade has worked as a staff writer and editor for Nature, Science, and the science section of the New York Times. Once upon a time, these were respected outlets. One wonders what Wade thinks of them now. We'll find out. But we start with his distillation of an underreported recent study some scientists argue is the quote-unquote smoking gun proof that COVID originated in the Wuhan virology lab rather than in nature, as Tony Fauci and Francis Collins demanded everyone believe. Let's start with this piece that you wrote about this underreported study that I just described per the documents that were obtained by an organization called U.S. Right to Know. What is it that paper tells us that we may have already suspected, but we didn't really know until those documents were obtained?
Well, we suspected that the virus was artificial and had been made through a standard method from 6 separate segments of DNA synthesized in a lab and then strung together into a complete virus. So that was a suggestion which had been made in 2022, but brushed aside by the scientists who have been advocating for a natural origin of the virus. Now, what the new document showed was that in a grant to the Defense Department, a team of American and Chinese scientists had proposed to make SARS-type viruses in exactly this way by synthesizing them from 6 separate pieces of DNA. So this gave electrifying support to this earlier paper that had been dismissed, suggesting that indeed the SARS-2 is a synthetic virus, because these authors from 2022 had seen what they said were the signature pieces of the seams left when you join the 6 bits together, and other indicative evidence of a synthetic origin. So this is the impact of the new documents that have been obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, a strong confirmation of the suggestion that the SARS-2 virus is synthetic.
And the strong substantiation that it's synthetic is because the argument, as I understand it from your piece, is that this sequencing you're describing does not occur in nature to the extent that scientists know.
Oh, right. These natural seams where you can join bits of DNA together, in an ordinary virus, they're sort of randomly spaced. But when you're making a synthetic virus, for reasons largely of convenience, you rearrange these sites so that they are evenly spaced and generate sort of equal length segments for you to knit together from your synthesized bit of DNA. So in SARS-2, these special sites are evenly spaced. Now, the reason the paper wasn't a bombshell when it came out is you can't absolutely rule out the possibility they might be evenly spaced in nature, and that's what all the critics of the lab-leak theory said. However, when you then find from the background documents to this very important grant application that the authors proposed to synthesize SARS-type viruses in this very way from 6 separate segments, that makes enormously more likely the idea that SARS-2 is a synthetic virus. And this adds to all the previous evidence from independent sources about different odd features of the virus pointing to a synthetic origin.
Well, and also important in this too, just piecing this case together, and then it sort of becomes, like a criminal court, like beyond a reasonable doubt. There may be a little bit of doubt, but is it reasonable doubt? You can't just say, well, it's possible, right? It has to be reasonable doubt. So the other part of this, the application you're talking about that was submitted to the Department of Defense for funding, that was rejected by the Department of Defense, involves some names that people know if you've been paying attention. Peter Daszak, Ralph Barrick, and Dr. Zhen Gali from Wuhan Virology Lab, right? This is the group that wanted to do what it turned out, it looks like got done, even though the Defense Department didn't finance it. And so there would be every incentive for that group to leverage their relationships with a Fauci and a Collins, for example, since Daszak had a good relationship there, and EcoHealth Alliance had gotten NIH funding, to say, throw people off the trail. Say we don't know. We think it occurred in nature, and then when some scientists start to question it, then Collins and Fauci are saying we need to suppress that viewpoint. Is that a fair sort of picture?
I believe so. If I could back up just one step, I think what happened after this grant had been proposed to the Defense Department, and then, as you say, turned down, a very interesting thing happened in that this team was led by Peter Daszak, and it had an American half and a Chinese half. So the American half was a lab run by Ralph Barrick, who's a leading expert on SARS-type viruses. And the Chinese part was run by Shi Zhengli at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So these two labs were sort of collaborators under the proposed grant. It's called the Defuse proposal. That's a sort of silly acronym. Once the Defuse grant was rejected by the Defense Department, probably because they thought it was far too dangerous, Barrick couldn't go any further. He didn't have the money. But Shi Zhengli, who was both his collaborator but also his rival, she would have realized that if she could only secure funding from Chinese sources, she could go ahead with this project. And that's what it seemed happened. She started the project in 2018 when it was turned down with her own funds. We know she was working in far too low safety conditions. It's called BSL-2, that's a very low level of safety, whereas Barrick did all his work in BSL-3. So Peter Daszak, the head of this project, says explicitly in these newly leaked documents that it would be much cheaper and more cost effective to do much of this work in Shi Zhengli's low security lab. So this would explain both the timing of the SARS-2 epidemic. She could have got these viruses prepared by 2019, which is when the epidemic first broke out. This explains both the timing and, of course, the place in Wuhan. So then coming back to your question, what did Fauci and Collins do about it? Well, they made this fateful decision to essentially cover it up. Instead of launching an investigation, they did everything they could to derail it. The little group of experts who first told them, we think this is an artificial virus, that was on January 30, 2020, when they first sent an email to Fauci. This little group was persuaded to change its mind almost overnight. And they ever since have spearheaded the campaign to argue this is a natural origin virus.
Didn't Ralph Barrick, I recall that Ralph Barrick gave an interview that was distributed online from years back where he talked about some of the dangers of this sort of experimentation that ostensibly was done, and so he would have. I mean, is that right? He was like publicly acknowledged some of the dangers of playing with these viruses in a lab setting, particularly if it was not very secure.
Yes, the record seems to show he took these viruses very seriously. He believed they were very dangerous, and he did all of his work in a fairly high level of containment called BSL-3.
Right.
Which is far higher than the BSL-2 used by Xi Jinping.
So if DARPA, the Defense Department, turns down the Daszak-Barrick Xi application, and Xi goes on to get her own funding from the Chinese Communist Party and does what they were going to do collectively, then why would Barrick and Daszak and Collins and Fauci, why would they run interference for the Wuhan Virology Lab and China when they can say, look, we had an application in, we were going to do this, it didn't get funded, we didn't do this, so you need to look at the Wuhan Virology Lab because they didn't abide the safety precautions that we would have abided had we been involved. Instead, they were all in league, seemingly, if this all checks out, to protect the Chinese Communist Party and the Wuhan Virology Lab at the expense of leveling with the American people. Why would they do that?
I think that's a very excellent point, and that's an answer we need to get. At present, one can only speculate, but I think the answer starts by sort of looking at all the ties that hold these people together. The people like Fauci and Collins sort of knew quite well their Chinese counterparts, and in particular a guy called Farah, who was head of the NIH equivalent in London, had very close ties with the Chinese. So they were all concerned, I think, to sort of smooth things over with their Chinese colleagues, sort of to dismiss this if this seemed to be just a little problem. And I guess one should keep in mind that in January 2020, it did seem like the epidemic might be contained, like its predecessor, the SARS-1. No one could really foresee it would become a pandemic. And another strong factor, I think, is these guys are all very, very sort of conscious of the threat to virology research and to scientific research in general. If it should turn out that scientists, by playing with fire with these gain of function techniques, i.e. enhancing the natural infectivity of viruses, if it should turn out that irresponsibility on the part of the scientific community and their funders, Fauci, Collins and Farah, that there will be an enormous blowback that would cause great damage to scientific funding for many years in the future. Plus, there was the possibility of dangerous, serious diplomatic ructions with the Chinese government if the US was to turn around and accuse them of spreading this plague. So you can see all these sort of meta considerations taking precedence over the course they should have followed, which was, of course, as you say, to throw open all the doors to have a thorough investigation and to give the public their best possible explanation of what had happened.
Yeah, it turns out to be very short-sighted. If what you're suggesting is what they were thinking, which is certainly plausible, it makes sense, then, I mean, their concerns in that direction have been realized exponentially because of their lack of candor, disclosure, whistleblowing, however you want to describe it, what they knew at the time or what they suspected at the time, and they chose not to be present in the conversation and work through, especially Daszak, work through back channels to Fauci and maybe to a lesser extent Collins.
I think that's right. I mean, the old saying is the cover-up's always worse than the crime. I think another factor here is that if you look at the field of gain-of-function research as a whole, and this fancy phrase simply means souping up viruses by all the wonderful genetic tools we now have to make them more infective. and you can argue there are various sort of reasons for doing this. This gain-of-function research had been promulgated by Collins and Fauci at the NIH for the past 10 years or so. And more or less, they'd gone down this very dangerous road without sort of seeking the advice and consent of the scientific community at large, which in previous cases like this has been done. So they decided to go it alone, to sort of beat back the criticisms of the arguments that this research was too dangerous ever to be worth the risk. And they sort of smothered opposition in sort of bureaucratic ways. So now when this suddenly blows up in their face, they have every reason to fear what has been done, because the responsibility is now on their shoulders. If they had consulted the scientific community as a whole, they could have said, well, everyone thought this was a fine idea, but that is not the case. They don't have that excuse.
So just on the point of gain-of-function research, because that, of course, has been a magic phrase that's been kicked back and forth between Rand Paul and Tony Fauci in hearings over the last couple of years. I mean, so what you're saying is that when Tony Fauci said never funded gain-of-function research, semantics aside, he lied to Congress and the American people. Is that right?
It certainly looks that way. I mean, I hesitate to give an absolute answer because gain of function has so many different definitions, and Fauci has used them to his own advantage. But basically, he was running a large research program that included research that many people would say was gain of function. So I think one can say he certainly was not being candid with Senator Paul.
Thinking about what's happening now, since you are on this beat and have been for so long, what do we understand about changes that have been made to funding protocols or funding decisions when it comes to virology? Have there been any, or is it under discussion? Is anything? Are there any lessons learned that are even being debated privately within the public health establishment?
As far as you can tell, nothing has changed. No one is willing to admit that this whole field needs to be rethought from bottom up, and they're still hiding behind the position that this virus came from nature, and therefore we don't have to do anything about it. Everything is just fine. We can go on with our research of trying to prevent new epidemics by sort of essentially creating them in the lab and making these dangerous viruses before nature does, so we can develop vaccines against them. That is the rationale for this whole research program. It is clearly flawed and has led to this disastrous consequence, but no one in the virology community is explicitly admitting that. So they haven't even taken step one to what you described should happen.
Just following up on the scientific journals in general, the scientific press, the members of the press that cover these issues, that have expertise in this sector, why would they go along with things that at least should have raised suspicions? Is it as simple as what George Carlin observed about Congress, that it's one big club and you ain't in it? Is that sort of the way the public health establishment works too? It's one big club, we protect each other, you ain't in it, and let's agree in terms, like collectively, in terms of how we're going to approach these things. And sometimes the truth is a casualty.
I'm not sure exactly of how this dynamic works. I suspect that the first move is the most critical, and once you take that decision to try and suppress the critics or the outsiders, or in this case the insiders, who are saying this is a manufactured virus, then it's very hard to sort of step back, especially if your efforts to bamboozle people are successful. So I think this conspiracy, if you like to call it, started off small, and then it just sort of grew. And it was so easy to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. That Fauci and Collins never looked back from there. But I think, indeed, you have to avoid the mistake of assuming omniscience on their part. I mean, back in February 1st, 2020, when they held this international teleconference, which was the place where the cover-up route began, they probably didn't know what happened. They knew Fauci's lab had supported research at the Wuhan Institute, but they couldn't be sure where the epidemic started. They were in the dark. So they had to choose whether to go for a full-out investigation or to sort of go the cover-up route. But I think they just sort of slid into the cover-up route because it was just so convenient for everyone. It avoided sort of ructions and a great deal of unpleasantness all around. That's my guess as to what happened, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not assuming omniscience on the part of Fauci or Collins. They've demonstrated that they're anything but omniscient when it comes to even their area of expertise. But I suppose too, I mean, I think people they have doctor and they have scientist in front of their names. But at the end of the day, they're political actors in a political system. And one of the things that you try to do in a crisis is tamp down hysteria. You try to control something that you may be deluding yourself that you can control. And, even to look at this in a way most favorable, most sympathetic to Fauci and Collins in that moment, perhaps that was part of it as well. They had sort of the hubris of thinking they could manage this and manage the the Western world's reaction to this, rather than just telling people what they knew as they knew it, the questions they had, what they were going to investigate, and follow a process and bring people along the entire time. It's sort of a lack of confidence in the American people and in people in general who aren't scientists or doctors.
Yes, I agree with what you say. I mean, you have to remember enormous sums of money were at stake here. I mean, there's Fauci's budget, which is very large, of just his little institute. He's part of the NIH, which has a much larger budget. So all this money, has to be voted by Congress each year, and is the subject of much of politicking. And both Fauci and Collins have been in those leadership roles for more than a decade. So for them to have admitted playing a significant role in this horrific disaster would have sort of just upset the whole apple cart. So you can imagine them, just for that reason alone, wishing this whole problem would go away. And for many months it seemed that it had gone away.
You wrote a piece in May of 2021, so a year after the sort of apex of uncertainty. The origin of COVID, did people or nature open Pandora's box at Wuhan? That was your piece. So this is a question they didn't want people asking. You asked it more than a year after the onset of the pandemic. What was the reaction you got within the universe in which you operate, the scientific community and the scientific press community?
Well, the article, to my surprise, was quite widely read. I mean, I placed it on medium.com, which essentially is a sort of self-publishing website, because I had failed to place it in any newspaper or magazine that I thought would have been interested. I was just rejected all around. So in the end, I decided, well, I'd sort of write this issue out of my system and get back to the book I meant to be doing and dump it onto medium.com. So I was delighted when it eventually got 1 million page views on Medium. It was immediately reprinted in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, where it got another 1 million views. And I think it was, media analysts have said that it sort of helped rekindle interest in this whole question of the origin of the pandemic, which for the previous a year and a half had been essentially buried. No one had written or thought about it. And this was the beginning of a resurgence of interest into what on earth had happened. So I was very gratified that through this surprising route, totally out of the sort of mainstream media path, I'd been able to bring this issue back to the public attention where it deserved its place.
The dramatic reduction in the percentage of Americans that are taking the jab, despite the Pfizer campaign, despite the Biden administration PSAs, and not just in America, but in the West as well. Isn't that an indictment of the public health, big pharma, government, media, industrial complex, that people, if it was safe and effective, that people, it would become, and it's promoted, continues to be promoted and incentivized, that people would make this part of their seasonal routine, and they're not doing that. Isn't that an indictment in a significant way of all that took place between 2020 and 2023?
I suspect you may be right. I'm not an expert in this area, so I probably shouldn't say too much. I do think vaccines are very important, and it's very important that the vaccine authorities keep the trust of the public, and it's extremely regrettable, not to say dangerous, when they fail to do so. To what extent that has happened in this case, I don't know. I suspect the jury is still out.
Well, right, and there's ongoing research thanks to the scientific community. I mean, this is sort of the silliness of the discussion for so long, was that there were some people who were anti-science, or some people who didn't want to understand the risks and benefits of the vaccine. They were just anti. Anybody who was not cheerleading was perceived to be an antagonist. I'm not anti-vax, but I didn't get vaccinated. And I'm certainly not anti-science. I just wish scientists would follow the scientific method as advertised and then be, transparent about it. But for example, I mean, the continued look at the VAERS data, the incidence of myocarditis, particularly among young men, and then making those risk-benefit analyses. The more and more information that comes out, just like we were talking about, the more and more information that comes out about the origin question, the worse and worse it looks for the public health establishment in terms of addressing legitimate concerns and questions people had in real time during the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the health authorities are always in a very difficult position with vaccines, because almost no vaccine is perfectly safe. And yet vaccines as a whole are enormously beneficial. So they have to sort of walk this line of saying, take your vaccine, but yes, here's a side effect. Here or there, we'll assess the magnitude. It's a hard thing to sell to the public, that a few casualties must be taken by the public in order for the larger public to be protected. How well that's been handled in this case, I don't know. I think it's just part of a fairly normal process for small-scale side effects to become apparent in the years after a vaccine is introduced, and that's just something one has to tolerate. It's part of the price of doing business.
But part of it was, in terms of the coverage, is we heard a lot about assertions of long COVID and a lot of debate, or actually a lot of suppressing debate about alternative treatments to the vax and so on and so forth. We didn't hear much, though, about some of the side effects of getting the vaccine for young people who we knew pretty early on were fairly safe as it came to serious health impact of COVID, depending on comorbidities and other variables. It's never singular. But I mean, what happened to the idea of here's what we know, here's what we don't, here's what you should do. Talk to your doctor. He knows probably as much as we do. They're studying it. Engage people in this, rather than saying, stand in your circle, put your mask on, take your shot, and shut up. I mean, what kind of approach to that is in terms of getting buy-in, right? And now thinking about the implications. So now when you have these reports out in the last couple of weeks, scientists say disease X, which could be the next pandemic, is 20 times stronger and more lethal than COVID. And I think for a large swath of the population, it just rolls off their back. It's, water off a duck's back, because, oh, here they go again scaring me, or trying to.
Well, I think you've put your finger on something that's really very difficult to resolve, and I don't know what the answer is. But if you're in the position of a public health authority, you need to project assurance and confidence, often in a way that goes somewhat beyond the facts you may have at the time, because in a new epidemic, facts are sort of pouring in from all sides, and you're trying to make quick scientific decisions on the spur of the moment. So you're suggesting, and very reasonably, that one should be totally frank with the public and sort of present all these uncertainties and say, we're scratching our head trying to figure it out. And in a way, that's absolutely right. On the other hand, I think in practical terms, it's a little difficult. And the public doesn't want to know about your uncertainties. The public wants to know, should we or should we not get a vaccine shot? And you have to tell them, yes, you should do X or Y, whatever the case is. So I think one has to be a little careful trying to trip these guys up for not having been more open about their internal scientific discussions.
Well, I mean, maybe part of this discussion, this post-mortem on COVID, should be, what do we expect from our elected as well as appointed officials, the experts that we're supposed to defer to? And for me, my disposition is I'm not a child, I'm an adult. So you can talk to me like an adult, and to not talk to me like an adult is to be disrespectful and patronizing, and I don't appreciate it. And maybe that's a larger cultural conversation about the relationship between the government and its constituents. Don't tell me beautiful lies, tell me the truth, so that, and offer the humility that is appropriate, because I understand that human beings, no matter their level of expertise, don't know everything. They don't get everything right, even in their narrow area of expertise. People can process that and make calculated decisions. People do that all the time with respect to health treatments. For example, cancer, here's the prognosis. Here's the percentage chance I have to survive for X number of years if I go through radiation. Here's what happens if I don't go through radiation. It's inexact. People are faced with those choices every day, and they make those choices as an individual, as a family. Why couldn't we do the same thing in a pandemic or with a viral outbreak?
Well, you may be right. Maybe that is the better way to go. I mean, I just don't know the answer on this. I just think many people won't have the degree of understanding that you have rightly expressed, and they'll just want to hear a clear answer from the government, even though the government may not really have a clear answer to give. So I think this is just a very difficult line for public authorities to walk. But that said, I mean, there should certainly be a post-mortem. We should certainly look back at all the decisions that were made during COVID, and it already seems that some of them had absolutely no foundation at all, like the keep 6 feet apart distance, and you sort of wonder the mindset in which public officials would put out such advice when it has no clear standing. And also, the essence of being a good scientist is to make a very clear distinction between what you know and what you don't know. And to the extent that Fauci and others were scientists, they should have expressed these uncertainties. And the fact that they didn't makes you realize they were acting as politicians, which to some degree is necessary if you're giving public health advice, but you have to do it very carefully, and it's not clear that they did it with the care they should have taken.
Well, I mean, talking about the 6 feet of distance, when Fauci says in closed-door congressional testimony that, I don't know, it just sort of happened. Well, so now after everything that we went through for those 3 years, all the death and destruction, and you were speaking authoritatively about these mitigations, and now you say, well, one of the ones that got repeated ad nauseum just sort of happened out of nowhere. I don't really know where it came from. Well, now you have betrayed my trust in a way that is unrecoverable for the next thing that is going to come out of your mouth or the agency you represent. And I just can't believe that people don't appreciate that. I mean, even if you just applied that sort of behavior on an interpersonal level, I mean, it's easy to understand, and to be so blithe about that approach to communicating during such a serious time it's really unfathomable and it's unconscionable.
You're right. Once the health authorities lose the public trust, I mean, the game is up. They're lost, and they've lost the very important ability to protect the population. There has to be a better way of doing it. I don't know what that is.
And something else, though, too, that has nothing to do with, politician and massaging this. What about just transparency? So, and this just came out within the last couple of weeks from Congressman Tom Massey, Kentucky. He posted this schedule he got from Anthem Health Insurance, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, and it's a schedule of doctors, and this was discussed in the COVID, the Select Committee on COVID as well, for doctors and hospital systems. If you get 30% of Anthem members vaccinated, you get a $20 bonus per vaccinated member. 40% you get this bonus. 75% you get this bonus. There's no gradations here. There's no for people with comorbidities, do this in rank order priority, consider these questions and factors when you're pushing the vaccine. And there was one pediatrician who testified before that COVID select committee saying, how do we go back to our patients now and say we couldn't say anything because we were under the threat of termination by the hospital system. We couldn't say anything because we were getting paid per this incentive program that pharma set up with the health insurance companies. So I couldn't tell you what I really thought about whether or not your son or your daughter should get vaccinated. I mean, the impact now on just the medical profession, pediatricians on up, in addition to the scientific community and what we understand about virology and molecular biology. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that if you're a pharma company, if you're a hospital system, if you're a doctor, you should be transparent about it. We are incentivized to push the vaccine. I still believe in it. I believe it in some cases. I don't believe in it, whatever your medical opinion is. But to not disclose this is to not disclose what appears to be a conflict of interest, what appears to be self-dealing. And attorneys get disbarred for that.
Well, I agree. A conflict of interest like that sounds very regrettable, and they should definitely find some other way of getting people vaccinated.
The scientific press, that particular subset of the media, when you look around for trusted voices, trusted research, trusted academics, where do you look? People always ask me as a radio talk show host, what are the things that you read to get, kind of a cross-section of opinion and to percolate some thoughts so that you come to what you think is accurate. And so I would say the same thing to you in an area of the press that I'm a layman. What do you look at? How do you think about consuming scientific information? Because I think after the last 3 years, a lot of people are saying, where can I get reliable scientific information that's distilled for the layman, that I can talk about intelligently, that I can ask experts about and get answers? Where do I go? What are some of the outlets or resources or even individuals?
Well, that's a very important point. I mean, 10 years ago, I would have said, well, the mainstream scientific journals are sort of Science and Nature, and if you look at them and similar journals, you will get a good view of what's really happening at the forefront of science. But unfortunately, these journals, along with much of the academic community, have become highly polarized. And I feel they cannot be trusted anymore, certainly not on any political subject. I mean, if you look at their editorials, they're very sort of partisan diatribes in favor of diversity programs, which, whether right or wrong, should have no place in a scientific journal. A scientific journal is meant to represent objective knowledge. So as soon as you start taking any political view, whether on one side or the other of any issue, you're no longer speaking as a scientist, you're speaking just as another politician. So the editors of these journals have unfortunately yielded to the temptation to become politicians without realizing, it seems, that this undermines the credibility of their whole enterprise. So Science and Nature can no longer be trusted as scientific journals. If you read some article about, I don't know, global warming, you have to ask yourself, well, is this a political point of view, or is this real science? And it used to be real science, but nowadays, who can tell? This sort of goes back to the politicization of these journals' audiences, which is basically the academic community itself. So, as we've seen, these recent events with Harvard and Pennsylvania, the whole academic world has been warped toward the left. I mean, warping either way is bad, but in the 19th. At times in the university's history, they've been too much in the pocket of industry and then warped toward the right. We don't want our universities warped in either way. We want them to be neutral, objective purveyors of fact, of providing objective information for the public to make political decisions. We don't want them to make political decisions themselves, but that's the place that they have got themselves into. And it means that everything they do is tainted. And the journals, the scientific journals, which reflect the output of scientists at these universities, have become tainted in the process, so that what we see is a massive institutional failure. And our society rests on its institutions. If our institutions fail, our society will fail. And our institutions are not doing their job right now, and that goes for the academic world and the scientific journals that draw from them.
So, I mean, there's no sort of flight to quality place you can point to. It's just going to have to be individual scientists and individual medical doctors, for example, because the New England Journal of Medicine fits the same description as Science and Nature. So does the Lancet, to some extent. And so you just have to pick out individuals, find those people who are have the expertise and are asking the right questions and have a healthy dose of skepticism and a healthy dose of humility, and just try to discern what they're saying and take the conversation from there. Is that sort of the best counsel that's available?
I think that's right. I mean, the whole issue of finding the truth has just become a lot more difficult. It's no longer enough just to sort of read a paper in Nature. You need to look to sources where the critics might express themselves. You have to look at Twitter is often very useful if there's a sort of dissenting community. So it's just much harder to find the truth than it used to be.
He is Nicholas Wade, the former science editor of the New York Times from 1990 to 1996. He's also the author of 3 books on recent human evolution: Before the Dawn, The Faith Instinct, and A Troublesome Inheritance. Nicholas Wade, thank you so much for joining us on Counterculture. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.